So with that, let's go to the phones and bring in our guy Patrick Stevens from USA Lacrosse. All right, Patrick, we're getting to the nitty gritty here, and we're looking at Cuse. You had them as your last team in yesterday, but the teams behind them were not very threatening. Where do things stand right now for Syracuse?
Yeah, I can tell you right now that if Syracuse gets three things that happen for them, if Yale loses in the Ivy League tournament, if Rutgers loses in the Big Ten tournament, and if Army wins the Patriot League tournament, Syracuse could go lose by a dozen goals to Notre Dame, and it's not going to matter. They'll make the tournament just because there isn't anybody really, like you say, threatening behind them. I mean, Michigan was kind of the one team that was sitting there that maybe had a chance to be a team that could poach an at-large bid if they won a couple games and then lost the Big Ten final. But they go out and they lose to Rutgers in the Big Ten quarters on Saturday, and so there's no pressure coming from below Syracuse. It's all going to be, does somebody get bumped into the at-large field? Is Cornell and Harvard and Princeton all going to need an at-large bid if Yale wins the Ivy League? That's essentially all that's going on. It's actually about as clean a look as you could possibly dream of heading into a conference tournament week.
So out of those scenarios to you, Patrick, which is Big Ten, Ivy League, and the Patriot, which is the most worrisome, I guess, if you're Syracuse right now? Which would you think would have the most likelihood of going against the Orange?
Well, as good as I think Army is, I think that the fact that they have to go win two games, they're not necessarily assured of a spot if they don't win the Patriot League. I think that's the scenario that's probably more worrisome, especially if they draw a Boston University team in the final that's really given them a lot of fits over the last few years. So, you look at a Rutgers, which has played really good defense and has had its moments offensively in the Big Ten, and Big Ten lacrosse is kind of like the stereotype of Big Ten football, where if you get to 10 points, you probably have a pretty good chance of winning. Historically in football, and certainly now in lacrosse at 10 goals. So, I don't know if Rutgers can score quite enough over two games, first against Ohio State and then against either Penn State or Maryland, to be able to pull that off. And you look at Yale, a team that has just struggled defensively a ton and is coming off an 18-7 loss to Princeton. I don't know if they have it in them to beat Cornell and then go and beat either Princeton or Harvard. Again, you got to go beat two likely tournament teams in that case. So I think the possibility of the Patriot League world against Army is the scenario that probably should frighten Syracuse fans more than any other.
I'd say go figure. Like, of all years, this is the year Syracuse and Army did not play each other in February, so there's no direct comparative data point between the two, like there has been way more often than not here in the last 20, 30, 40 years. We got Patrick Stevens with us of USA Lacrosse Magazine. Okay, let's say Syracuse did beat Notre Dame the last time they played, so let's say that scenario plays itself out again and the Orange win this game. Does that eliminate all danger? And if Syracuse wins that game, who takes the Orange's spot on the bubble in that case?
It might be Harvard, depending on what it winds up doing in the Ivy League tournament. So I think them and possibly Duke as well kind of in that mix, although Duke has 6 top 20 wins at this point. Yeah. Top 10 in both the RPI and the strength of schedule. I think it would take quite a bit for them to get squeezed out. But I would say Harvard would be that next team that might be in a little bit of danger. I mean, Harvard basically has hung a lot on that early victory over Syracuse. Right. And so the funny thing there is if Syracuse beats Notre Dame, Harvard's profile gets better in the process because Syracuse's profile gets better in the process.
Yeah, everybody you look at the top 10 right now, they're all interwoven in some crazy way. Like, there's not a lot of, they've all played each other this year, go figure, which is probably why there's such a clear demarcation point right this year, Patrick. It feels like, the top 10, top 12, whatever, you can find easy comparisons, and then there's that gap to everybody else. I don't know about you. I don't remember a bubble like this soft. You've done this a long time. I don't remember it ever being like this distinctly clear cut as it is this year.
Yeah, I don't know if soft is the word so much as non-existent. Yeah. And the RPI formula. I want like 10 seconds to just sort of explain it here, where it's basically it's a fraction essentially. You're adding up 25% of a winning percentage, 50% of an opponent's winning percentage, 25% of an opponent's winning percentage. And so the number that Syracuse sat at going into yesterday was .61972, and Michigan was at .57202, which, doesn't sound like it really matters that much, but the gap between Syracuse at 11 and Michigan at 14 is actually larger than the gap between Syracuse at 11 and Cornell at 3.
Wow.
So, the committee gets to look at those numbers, and I know from talking to committee chairs in the past that those are numbers that do get looked at. I mean, it's pretty hard to ignore the fact that the gap between the next best team in the at-large field and Syracuse is really that large. So, I will throw up one other team out there that might kind of be a wrinkle in this, is Richmond out of the A-10, but it's a team that has only 2 top 20 wins. It's not going to get one if it loses in its conference tournament, and those top 20 wins are against St. Joe's and against a sub-500 Virginia team. So even though Richmond's in the top 10 of the RPI, it might make for an interesting comparison. I think that ultimately that Syracuse would win that scenario as well.
Yeah, and heck, even if Richmond loses that league, that means no matter what, they've added a pretty bad loss down the stretch to the year here. And then the other crazy part of it here, and this is probably realistically the most important part as we project this forward, is, the bubble down to the tournament is about the same in the opposite direction, right, to the bubble of hosting first-round games. So we talk about Syracuse being on one bubble. They're also on the other bubble. If they win the ACC tournament, do you think they get a game in the Dome? What would they have to do to jump up that high?
Well, you're kind of looking at, first off, what does Ohio State do? What does Harvard do? I do think that they would have a pretty decent chance of dislodging Duke from one of those spots if they were able to pick up what would likely be a couple of top 10 wins here this weekend. I think you're looking at Syracuse being in a spot where they're either going to get that home dome advantage, that traditional Sunday 7:30 in the evening start to cap the first round, or I think there's a really good chance that just given who else is kind of hanging around, in those 5, 6, 7, 8 spots right now, it would not be shocking to see Syracuse sent to either Penn State or Ohio State for the first round. So a home game against any number of teams, maybe an Army, maybe a Harvard, or a road trip probably to Ohio State or Penn State.
And, I think we've both seen these lacrosse brackets long enough to know, Patrick, that while, at least at the moment, Ohio State makes a lot more sense for seating-wise, Columbus is further from Syracuse, and you can hop on a bus and go to Penn State. We've seen the brackets break down like that far too often.
Exactly. Now the interesting thing from the committee's perspective, I think not to say they're rooting for anything, but in terms of making their geography lesson, which they're supposed to limit the number of flights to 2 in the first round, and anybody that's within 400 miles can bus rather than fly. So, Syracuse can fly to Ohio State but could bus to Penn State. The best case scenario in terms of solving the geography problem is if Ohio State loses to Rutgers in the Big Ten semifinals and then just gets shipped to Notre Dame to play a first-round game. And they basically, instead of using 2 flights to get people to those places, they don't use any. And can basically have bracket integrity pretty much everywhere else in the field.
Yeah, or if they could create a straight shot road from Syracuse to Columbus, you might be able to shave it, because the current number, I'm looking at 470 miles. There's some mountains in the way, so I don't know if that's going to get done, and a bunch of trees. I don't know if that's going to get done before this weekend. We got Patrick Stevens from USA Lacrosse Magazine. Let's go top of the bracket now here. At least as of yesterday, you had Maryland 1, Cornell 2, Princeton 3, Penn State 4, so the 2 top Big Ten and the 2 top Ivy League teams. Is Maryland a clear one for you right now? Can Cornell or Princeton catch them? How do you see that at the moment?
I think Cornell can, and if Maryland doesn't win the Big Ten and Cornell wins the Ivy League tournament, I think there's going to be a pretty compelling argument to put the Big Red at number 1. I don't know if Princeton has it in them to catch Maryland, in part because Maryland has a head-to-head win at Princeton back in February. So I think there's kind of a line of demarcation right now at 1, 2, and 3. And then 4, 5, and 6, I mean, you really could go in any order you wanted with Penn State, North Carolina, and Notre Dame. I kind of gave the edge to Penn State at this point because they do have, the only victory over Cornell this season. That's sort of the joker in the deck there. Is that victory, and then Carolina and Notre Dame at 5 and 6, and then I think Ohio State 7 and Duke 8 at this point. But back to your original point, like I think Maryland's probably looking at a 1 or a 2. I mean, they've got 8 top 20 wins. They have 5 top 10 wins at this point, like 5-0 against the top 10 during the regular season, or at least as it's currently constituted. So the Terps, I think, in really, really good shape. And if they win one game, I mean, it's really hard to imagine if they beat Penn State on Thursday tomorrow, that they're not going to be at least the number 2 seed.
All right, and let me ask you this here, because you've seen these games, Patrick. I mean, usually at this point of this year, okay, yeah, you're figuring out the seeding and all this, but like we all have in our head, like, all right, here's the 2, 3, 4 teams that, barring something nuts, like this is our group that the title is coming from. Or last year it was like Notre Dame's going to win the title, barring something really wonky. I'm looking at it this year. I don't even know where I draw the line. It certainly would be further down than 3 or 4. How many do you have in the pool this year that you think can legit win the championship?
It might be like 8 or 9.
Wow.
At this point. I don't know if Duke has it in them, but Maryland, Princeton, Penn State, Carolina, Notre Dame, Cornell, Ohio State, even Army, I think all warrant at least some attention here on that front. I look at a team like Ohio State that had won 12 in a row or 11 in a row, and they've got all these older guys that have been through some tough seasons. And the way that they won their regular season finale, they went to Michigan. They struggled for 20 minutes in the second half to score, and they basically just scored 5 goals in a row on 5 consecutive possessions to close out that thing in the last 6 minutes. And that had the look of a team that's like, that's going to be a problem for somebody. And so, Cornell, I think, is probably the team that most people would agree is the most likely team that we're going to see at least make it to Foxborough. But I don't really feel all that comfortable about too many predictions with this particular field. I don't think there's a massive difference 1 to 10 or so this season. And like you said, last year it was Notre Dame and everybody else. The year before it was those top 3 ACC teams. The year before it was Maryland and everybody else. So definitely a different type of deal.
I'd say Cornell, they'd be a very popular champion. I mean, they got the best player in the country in Kirst. They haven't won since the 70s. It would be certainly the last time they were there. They got their heart broken by, they got their heart broken by Syracuse in that game. They go figure, is more than 15 years ago now. But how about Syracuse here? I mean, they opened the season at 2. You lose the Maryland game. I think the Harvard game really opened a lot of people's eyes to be like, okay, is there something a little wonky here? That you get a little hot, you beat Notre Dame, then I don't know what's gone on the last 3 weeks. What do you make of Syracuse right now?
One of the interesting things to me about this Syracuse team coming into the season, and this doesn't really apply to very many teams, it almost felt like the first thing that was really, really going to matter was when they got to a quarterfinal game, right? Like they had made that logical step last year where they made the tournament for the first time in a while, and they'd won a tournament game, and they were on the doorstep, and they've got all these guys in that junior class, and you're like, next logical step is to punch through and make it to Memorial Day weekend for the first time in a dozen years. And it almost feels like everything up to this point is just like, nobody really is going to remember any of this so long as they find themselves in a quarterfinal again. And so I agree that they're not, frankly, as good as a lot of people thought they were going to be. This is a Syracuse team I kind of figured was going to be on a very smooth track at this point. But at the same time, they've had their moments. I mean, that Notre Dame game was pretty compelling. And it's not as if when you look at those losses, it's not as if they have bad losses. And they lost to what? They lost to Maryland. They lost to Carolina. They lost to Duke. They lost to Harvard, and they lost to Cornell. I mean, you're talking about 5 likely tournament teams there. So it's not as if they've been, taking terrible losses. But I would agree that you kind of look at that game on Saturday is almost a perfect microcosm. Like, how do you find yourself down? What was it, 6 late in that game, and then almost come back and win it? Like you're just kind of seeing 2 different versions of the same team within a 2-hour window. So I almost feel like I said earlier, like this is a Syracuse team that was always going to be defined by what did it do once it got back to the quarters. And now the key over the next 2 weekends is to make sure they actually get themselves there, because it doesn't seem as certain as it did at the start of the season.
No, it does not, which is why we're talking about the bubble in the first place. Tim Leonard dropped this stat on me earlier today. I think it's the last 4 games now, 3 games maybe. Syracuse is clearing it at 72% in that span, which is... It's shocking. They'd been in the 90s before that. You know that, Patrick? Like, this time of year, like, you can't be worrying about the basics, right? Like, you got to have the basics buttoned down at this point of the year.
Yeah, and you know, the interesting thing in there, though, is, you know, some of that probably comes down. You face Carolina, a team that 10-man rides. You face Notre Dame, a team that's known to 10-man ride.
Yeah.
You see that? I feel like we're seeing that more and more. More teams using that than maybe in a typical era. So I suspect that has a little something to do with it. But at the same time, you're right. Like, you got to kind of make sure you're not committing penalties, that you're taking care of the ball, all those things. Because at the end of the day, at this point, the possessions really do matter. Every single one of them do.
Yeah, the exciting stuff doesn't matter if you're not doing the basics at this time of the year. All right, Patrick, tomorrow's May. It's the most fun time of the year in the lacrosse world. Thanks so much for hopping on and giving us the preview of what's to come here.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, there he is, Patrick Stevens. Checks out his stuff, lacrosse bracketologist, USA Lacrosse magazine. Always great to talk a little lax with Patrick this time of year. Phone lines open next a little bit at 315-437-7644. We're back next in this hour, brought to you by William Matar. It's Q Sports Talk and ESPN Radio.